Despite being an overspill estate designed to accommodate the surplus population from the nearby city, when it was first built, the Marston Estate in Moulton was originally advertised as being in the countryside. In a way, it was true. Travel 20 or 30 minutes in pretty much any direction from the state, and you would hit rolling hills and enough green to justify the countryside label. On the estate, however, green was at a premium. A seemingly endless maze of pebble-gray, the estate was the color of concrete simply because most of it was concrete. Sure, we had the odd patch of scratchy used-to-be grass, but they were badly neglected. There was a playground for kids, but back in those days, the surface around it, to cushion potential falls, was made of either soggy dark brown wood chips that stuck to your clothes or else some sort of foam rubber that arrived in a lurid shade of faded pink like a slab of uncooked ham. When the weather decided to mirror the architecture, the estate could be a thoroughly depressing place to look at, with seemingly not a scrap of green anywhere, except for a short time on the Coltrane house. The greenhouse, though of course that was burnt to ashes many years ago, taking all of the green it had displayed with it. Or at least, we hoped. It all started with Kevin Coltrane's mom. Her name was Sandra, and she worked as a cleaner at one of the hotels in the city, making the commute there and back by bus every morning and fixing the rooms for the next set of guests before they arrived. One of the few perks that Miss Coltrane, as we called her, gained from this job was an unspoken understanding that whatever guests left in the room when they checked out, it could be claimed by the cleaners. Now, obviously, if the items were valuable and clearly left by accident, something like a wedding ring or an iPod perhaps, then the cleaners would put it into lost property. Beyond that, though, the job presented many opportunities to pick up random found goods. Often the items were things that hotel patrons had bought whilst in the city or in the country, and which their meager baggage allowances would not allow them to take on their departing flights. According to Kev's mom, the sheer variety of things people left behind was staggering, ranging from the perfectly mundane, bottles of spirits, items of clothes, or half-open packets of foodstuff, to the downright strange, such as a medieval axe, a box containing 50 individual chess sets, and even once, a live chicken. On one occasion, the one relevant to this story, Kev's mom was surprised to walk into one of the rooms and find an enormous potted plant sitting on the table that had been purposely dragged into the center of the room. For some reason, the patron had moved all of the other furniture to the outer walls and had placed the plant in the center like it was some kind of strange monolith, something which, as the person charged with putting all that furniture back, annoyed Sandra to no end. Still, there was the plant. As someone who clearly felt somewhat starved of green, Sandra considered the plant to be quite the find and with some difficulty heaved the enormous thing, almost 5 feet in height, back on the bus all the way home. Having set it up in the small yard facing the porch on her outside wall, she took great pride in showing it off to her neighbors, who feigned excitement but were frankly entirely disinterested. When they did become interested, however, was around a month later, when it became clear that the plant was intent on making itself very comfortable indeed. From its initial base within the plant pot, the plant had put out feelers, a clinging, crawling network of small tendricles similar to those you'd find with vines or more common ivy. These tendricles fixed themselves to the brick wall and pebble dash on the outside wall of the Coltrane house and proceeded to climb, creeping ever further and across the wall. At first there was just a small patch in the bottom right corner, but by the time summer arrived a month or two later, the spread of leaves and stalks seemed to have grown exponentially, expanding out in every direction in strange fractional patterns, so that each new slip in the vine, 4 or 5 more grew from it. By the time autumn arrived, the entire side of the Coltrane house was covered from top to bottom with a thick carpet of green that made the house stand out from any other on the estate like a sore thumb. A few neighbors, clearly jealous of the character the ivy-like vines lent to the building, complained to the council, suggesting that the creepers might damage the integrity of the building, though how the damage to someone else's house would affect them was never actually made clear. As for Sandra, she was pleased as punch with the new addition and boasted about it to anyone who would listen. It did not take long for the local children to make the Coltrane house a local landmark, referring to it now not by the name of the family who lived there, but instead of the greenhouse. The name was appropriate, for as the year progressed, the green showed absolutely no signs of slowing down. Clearly unaffected by changes in climate and continuing to grow even when it was dusted with snow, the plant spread over the front of the house, onto the roof and down so that it drooped like a huge veranda curtain over the upper windows. Kev even complained at school about having been given the chore of clipping these window fringes with shears every week, something that he presented as an imposition upon his time and plans, not to mention his hectic schedule of doing sod-all. It wasn't until the end of winter that the first strange stories began to circulate about the greenhouse and the plant that now held it in its inescapable grip. The first I heard was from a boy named Jack, who claimed that despite having a paper route that should have passed directly by the greenhouse, he instead took the long way around, adding 15 minutes to his journey in order to avoid it. This, he said, was an account of how one morning before the sun had risen, he had cycled slowly past the house and heard, in his words, the green talking to him. It was like a whisper, he said, deadly serious and without the slightest hint of humor. A light voice that kind of ran along the vines like water might inside them. It started at one end and followed me, moving along like a little wave. I remember turning around to check if there was anyone there, but you know yourself how quiet the estate is at that time in the morning. Still, I could hear it, this low little whisper. I thought it must be coming from the other side of the wall, or that maybe it was Kev messing about. But then I saw the tips of some of the vines. They were sort of dancing, moving and stretching in all one direction towards me. I waved my arm and watched as they changed direction, following the movement like they were attached to the heat or something. Anyway, it creeped me out something proper, and that was it. I never went back. When I asked Jack precisely what the green had supposedly said to him, he screwed up his face in a mixture of disgust and what looked suspiciously like fear before whispering, it said, "Come in, we're waiting." A few months later, another boy, whose real name I never really knew but people always just called Roddy, was apparently taken ill after claiming that he had seen something decidedly odd going on with the wall of plants. According to Roddy, who assured everyone that he had never touched drugs in his life, he had been walking past the greenhouse one evening when the large tulip-shaped bulbs that had appeared on the far wall began to yawn open. I looked up at it, just wondering what it might be like inside. I read about plants like this that only open once every few months, and I was a bit curious to see it, so I looked up. Thing is, the plant, it looked back. According to Roddy, when the bulb of the tulip opened, it showed inside a perfectly formed eyeball, complete with iris and pupil, drooping down at the end of the thick stem like an optic nerve, the leaves of the bloom forming the sphere in the same way the eyelids might on a human eye. Then they all opened, he went on. All of them at once, loads of them just opening up at once and watching me, seeing me. Then it said, "Come in." Of course, on any estate, these kinds of wild stories spread fast. In a place like Moulton, they spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before neighbors were again complaining to council. This time with concerns that the plant might spread, as kudzu has in the southern United States, to cover and climb against everything. In fairness, this time those neighbors were half right. It had spread over everything, though not as they had thought, on the outside. It was probably about a week after we last saw Kev that the council came knocking on his mother's door. When it was made clear that she had inexplicably stopped showing up for work and in fact had not been seen for weeks, people began to become concerned. Still, it wasn't another week before they decided to kick in the door. What they found, I'll be honest, and say I never saw for myself. What I heard, though, was that the entire inside of the house from ceiling to floor, across the carpets, over the furniture, and wound over every surface was an immense blanket of all-encompassing green. The plant had covered every surface. The sofa, the sink, the fridge, and even the beds, which according to one person I spoke to, still had people sleeping in them at the time. Whether Kev Coltrane and his mother did meet a strange end inside the greenhouse, I don't know. Some say that he simply moved away, and that he and his mother had been moving cities on the spur of the moment for years. Maybe he did, maybe not. What is certain is that a few days after they initially opened it up, the council took the trouble to get rid of the plant by torching the house, burning it entirely to cinders and spraying it down with weed killer and other chemicals so that the whole area smelled faintly of synthetic orange and charcoal for months. Not that it did any good, you understand. Whilst there is no longer any green on that corner of the estate, a friend of mine who works for the council assured me that the problem is far from gone. Opening up a manhole to do a routine inspection of the sewers last month, he noticed that the entire stone cylinder of the sewer tunnel was covered with a strange tangle of ivy and leaves. Tons and tons of the stuff, stretching on for miles. It's going to cause a blockage if people aren't careful. It's weird, he said as he told me, a sheepish, almost apologetic look coming over his face. But as I was looking at it, I could have sworn I heard voices down there, someone telling me to come in. Some little voice just whispering and hissing from somewhere underneath. It gave me the creeps. Maybe, I thought as he said it, there is more green on the Marston estate than any of us like to think.